What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and I'm sat here in front of a bunch of CPU coolers. So this can only mean one thing: CPU cooler testing. And the CPU of choice is the beast itself, so the 64-core 128-thread Threadripper 3990X. This beast is not easy to tame, so the results that we're going to show are actually quite interesting. Make sure you stay tuned. What makes Threadripper in particular difficult to cool is the sheer size. I mean, this is like kind of big even compared to my hand. This is a massive, massive chip, and most CPU coolers simply are not designed for a heat spreader this big and the underlying heat producing components over such a large area on the package, and that is challenging. Threadripper 3000 and especially the 3990X, they are different to Threadripper 1000 and Threadripper 2000. Threadripper 1000 and 2000 was up to 4 dies on the package, and they were somewhat center weighted, so the dies could dump their heat towards the center of the heat spreader if you had a non-full cover cold plate or water cooling block on your AIO or your air cooler. That is different with Threadripper 3000 because the core chiplets are separate to the central I/O die. Now that relatively low power I/O die is in the center, but the core chiplets are nearer the edges, and they are the significant heat producing and thermally dense chiplets. And on the 3990X, they're actually very close to the edge of the chip because it has so many core chiplets. As you can see on the table in front of me, we've got 3 A-type coolers, and the Noctua here is single and dual fan mode, so we've got different configurations for air coolers, and we've got one big 280mm AIO liquid cooler. And I think for workstation type builds like this, where you have to use it for maybe 3 to 5 years and it just has to be fire and forget, it's going to run over the weekend, it's going to run over extended break periods at full pelt, the reliability, the longevity, and the simplistic design, quite frankly, of air coolers are, in my opinion, a big benefit. But we are looking at the AIO cooler for reference. And I guess if we just build on that point, it's actually really difficult to find a good AIO cooler for Threadripper. As we've already said, you need realistically a Threadripper specific cooler because the heat spreader is so large. Now, there are a few AIO coolers on the market which are Threadripper specific. The Enermax LickTech and the LickTech 2 are the most obvious choice, but there's no way we're using those. Gamers Nexus and some other guys have done some absolutely superb work on why you probably should avoid the Enermax coolers. Equally so, the Acertec or Coolit style, so the Corsair type coolers, or the NZXT, or whoever you prefer, those specific coolers are not Threadripper specific, as you can see from the cold plate sizing, but they do support Threadripper. And we spoke to AMD in the past, and they said they do run tests internally with the Acertec style and Acertec size AIO liquid coolers. So, you know, you could use one of those, but it's not necessarily Threadripper specific or Threadripper optimized. The alternative is we see a couple of TR4 specific coolers from Cooler Master and from Thermaltake. But if you dig a little bit deeper, what you actually see is while these are Threadripper sized cold plates, realistically it's just a thin sheet of copper that is extended to Threadripper sizing, where the fundamental cooling hardware inside the block, the microfins, the point at which the liquid actually hits the block, that is realistically the smaller mainstream platform sizing, so they're kind of not entirely Threadripper. And for that reason, that's why we just went with a good high-end Corsair 280mm AIO. So this is the new H150i Pro RGB XT. As far as we're concerned, one of the best AIO coolers on the market. So we have every chance of giving Threadripper a fair fight on the AIO cooler. You can see on the table in front of me the coolers that we selected for testing today. We've got the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro TR4. We've got the IceGiant Pro Siphon Elite 2019 prototype. We've got the Noctua NHU14S TR4 SP3 version in both single and dual fan mode. And we've got the Corsair iQ H150i Pro RGB XT 280mm AIO. I hope I got that name right. We'd also intended to include the Arctic Freezer TR50, but we couldn't include it because it just has RAM interference issues, so we actually couldn't install it with G-Skill Trident Z modules, which are moderately sized, quite frankly. Additionally, we'd also begun some testing with the Cooler Master Wraithripper but we quickly discovered that it's basically just not up to the performance hierarchy of these other coolers on show, so we just basically eliminated most of its test data and didn't continue the testing with it. Anyway, that's enough talk about these coolers. If you want to see more details, head on over to the Kit Guru website, and make sure you check out the websites if you want to see specific ways in which these coolers differ from each other, how they're designed, their features, etc. So head on over to the Kit Guru website, head on over to the individual websites. Let's look at the testing procedure. I'm going to try my best to not spend too much time outlining the testing procedure in this video because it's all written up in full over on the Kit Guru website, so I please recommend you go over there and have a look at the in-depth testing procedure. To quickly summarise, as I've already said, we're interested in maximum performance. All the coolers will be run at full speed fans, including the IceGiant at reduced speed fans to make it a bit more comparable to the other air coolers. We'll also record the noise levels, but we're not using noise normalized specific testing or temperature normalized specific testing. All out performance is what we want to see here. We've got two specific test procedures from the CPU perspective. One is a manual overclock with a 3990X running 3.6 GHz, 1.075 volts on all 64 cores and 128 threads. In this specific manual overclock environment, we're doing about 400 watts CPU power, or sometimes a bit more, and we'll run this load with Cinebench R20 in loop on all 128 threads for 30 minutes. The other cooling test that we run is with the 3990X using Precision Boost Overdrive on our MSI Creator TRX40 motherboard. We use 1000 watts package power limit, 1000 amps TDC, 1000 amps EDC, and plus 200 megahertz frequency target. And the reason we use this is because with the 1000 watt package power allowance, this basically allows the CPU to run in a power unlimited scenario whereby it'll take as much power as the CPU cooler and the motherboard can realistically handle. For this specific test, rather than doing the back-to-back Cinebench runs with that period of downtime, we thought it'd be quite good to do a continuous heavy load to mimic real-world continuous heavy load situations. So we're using AIDA64 CPU, FPU and cache stress test, and we run this for 30 minutes and record the steady state temperature after the 30-minute period. For testing, we're using the Fractal Meshify S2 tempered glass chassis. This is a very good airflow chassis. We're using the two stock 140mm fans in the front as intake at 1000 RPM full speed, and then we've got the one 140mm stock fan in the rear as exhaust at full 1000 RPM speed. The motherboard is an MSI Creator TRX40 motherboard, so very strong power delivery solution on this board. For the graphics card, we use an EVGA GTX 1080 Ti SC2 ICX version. We mount that in one of the lower slots so that it doesn't interfere with the CPU coolers, or in the case of vertical airflow direction CPU coolers, it doesn't block the airflow. We also set its fan to the 0 RPM mode so that it basically doesn't interfere with the results. And for the ambient, it's around about 23 degrees Celsius in our test environment. This does fluctuate by about 1 degree Celsius, typically higher, so up to about 24. If it goes any higher than that, we will run additional repeated tests to ensure the consistency of the data, especially with Precision Boost Overdrive, which is very sensitive to changes in ambient temperature. Like I've already said, if you want more details on the test procedure, the test hardware, all the test setup, head on over to the Kit Guru website. And if you have any questions, make sure you head on over there because some of the questions are probably answered with regards to the testing. Anyway, let's jump into the performance. Starting out with PBO temperatures, we see, unsurprisingly, each cooler running the 3990X at its 95 degrees Celsius temperature limit. The only real point of importance here is that none of the coolers are sufficiently overpowered to run the CPU below its 95 degrees Celsius limit when mounted inside our Fractal chassis. This power chart is more important than straight temperatures when looking at PBO results. The indication of higher power draw is a positive from a CPU cooler's perspective, as it highlights how a unit can handle more thermal load from the CPU than its competitors, which should, in theory, translate into greater overclocking capability. We see the IceGiant ProSiphon Elite topping the chart with a reported CPU package power allowance of just under 500 watts. That is a remarkable result from a cooler that is fundamentally air in design, even if fan speeds are high. Noctua's single tower NHU14S in both single and dual fan mode also puts in an excellent showing with performance close to that of the speed reduced IceGiant cooler. 450 watt package power from this trio of air cooling configurations is excellent. Corsair's AIO manages around 400 watts package power, which is respectable given its limited heat spreader coverage. Be Quiet rates the Dark Rock Pro TR4 for 250 watts TDP on the box, whatever that means and however that's tested. So the cooler's result of 365 watts 3990X CPU package power is certainly strong, but it is a little surprising compared to Noctua's physically smaller competitor. More on this point later. Cooler orientation and the fact that some units see the power delivery system pumping less juice into the CPU make the VRM temperature results somewhat misleading. Be Quiet and Corsair perform well because they only manage to force less power through the VRM. Corsair's AIO also has airflow direction with respect to the motherboard VRM heatsink in its favour. We see orientation influence putting the Pro Siphon Elite into a strong position. Despite delivering just shy of 500 watts to the CPU, the VRM temperature with the Pro Siphon Elite's full-speed fans was a very reasonable 78 degrees Celsius, thanks to airflow passing the motherboard VRM heatsink efficiently. Despite drop in power delivery by around 10%, the slower fan speeds of the IceGiant 1500 RPM run results in VRM temperatures pushing up to 84 degrees Celsius, which is still a reasonable number. Noctua's power delivery numbers are almost directly comparable to the lower speed IceGiant run, but the Austrian cooler's orientation results in slightly less favourable VRM thermals, but the numbers are still fine. Zen 2 takes a lot of extra power to deliver small gains in frequency, especially on 64 cores already pushed past 3 GHz. Unsurprisingly, the unit that handled the most power, IceGiant's Pro Siphon Elite in 2200 RPM fan speed form, delivered the greatest average CPU clock frequency at just under 3.7 GHz. The slower speed IceGiant and Noctua runs resulted in around 100 MHz less clock speed for the roughly 10% power delivery drop. Dropping another roughly 10% off the CPU cooling power capability reduces averaged all-core clock speed by another roughly 100 MHz for the Corsair 280mm AIO. And then we have the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro TR4 at the bottom of the chart with its 3275 MHz result. Almost 3.3 GHz on a 64-core chip is certainly a solid result, but Be Quiet's unit is notably slower than the competitors in our testing. We're going to quickly flash the data versus runtime graphs on screen. If you're interested in these dynamics, make sure you pause the video to have a closer look at the trends, and also head on over to the KitGuru website to see them with more analysis. What you will note briefly with these graphs is that the higher performance CPU coolers are better able to reduce the rate of decay of the CPU power delivery curve. This, in turn, allows those better coolers to maintain the higher boost clocks for a greater period of time. This time around, with our frequency locked and therefore somewhat power locked manual overclock test mode, we see significant temperature differences between the coolers tested. With a 77 degrees Celsius reading, the coolest operator here, and this time by a notable margin, is the IceGiant Pro Siphon Elite with its 2200 RPM fans. This heavy thermal load scenario is clearly an environment whereby the IceGiant and its thermosiphon technology can deliver superb results, provided you have fans with sufficient speed and pressure to force air through the dense fin array. Both Noctua U14S configurations deliver sub 90 degrees Celsius readings, which we would say is very impressive given the low speed, noise optimized fans. Equally so, the speed-reduced IceGiant result is perfectly good as it roughly matches the Noctua cooler, albeit not quite the dual fan configuration. As we saw with PBO results, the Corsair 280mm AIO cannot match the IceGiant and Noctua and just about manages to keep our chip at 100 degrees Celsius steady state with a few jumps to 101 and 102 Celsius. The dual tower Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro TR4 failed this test as the power usage from the CPU was too high and the processor crept up towards 110 degrees Celsius and the system crashed within a couple of minutes of loading. We'll refrain from being overly critical of the Be Quiet cooler, however, as we also run this demanding load with the Cooler Master Threadripper. Cooler Master's more costly unit had a quicker time to system crash through processor overheating, and this was in the order of seconds, not minutes like with the Be Quiet cooler. Plus the Dark Rock Pro TR4 was far less noisy. In this power draw test, lower is better. That is because the fixed frequency CPU overclock should, in theory, run at the same power draw across all CPU coolers. In reality, that is not the case as some CPU coolers are better than others. The coolers that allow for lower CPU temperatures should help to reduce the power consumption at the fixed frequency as there is less leakage. Yet again, the IceGiant Pro Siphon Elite with its 2200 RPM fans tops the chart thanks to its lead-in cooling performance. Noctua's single and dual fan U14S as well as the speed-reduced Pro Siphon Elite are next in the hierarchy. These coolers run at around 410 to 415 watts CPU package power each, and their system-wide power delivery numbers is just about close enough to be called even. Corsair comes in bottom position with the 280mm AIO that does not cover the entire Threadripper heat spreader, but that's mainly because Be Quiet and Cooler Master failed to position on this chart. CPU package power draw for Corsair was reported at 415 watts, but the system-wide power draws are notably higher at 665 watts. This implies that inefficiency losses are present in the system, perhaps at the VRM level, as the CPU is simply running so hot. Power in the high-speed fans, pump and RGB lighting also adds a little power draw to the Corsair numbers. As was the case with PBO testing, VRM temperatures are influenced by CPU cooler airflow direction. This time, however, the power delivery through the VRM is close across the board and is therefore more directly comparable than with the PBO test. IceGiant's full-speed configuration fares best as its airflow orientation is ideal for our motherboard, plus it required a little less power to be delivered by virtue of its chart-topping CPU cooling performance. Corsair's AIO is next in terms of performance. Corsair overcomes its higher CPU and system-wide power draw and delivers strong VRM cooling. Again, this is due to the optimal airflow direction in our test system. Somewhat surprising is how close the speed-reduced IceGiant configuration's performance is to the Noctua option. The ProSiphon Elite and its optimal airflow direction for VRM cooling registers 82 degrees Celsius VRM temperature, while the Noctua configurations are 84 and 86 degrees Celsius. All three of these lower fan speed configurations are perfectly capable from a VRM cooling perspective. I would say at this point you're probably wondering what on earth is going on with the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro TR4. Why is it being beaten so convincingly by the physically smaller and relatively similar fan speed Noctua U14S unit? You have to look at the base specifically. While this is a Threadripper sized base specifically, you have to look at the heat pipe and base configuration. On the Be Quiet unit and also the Cooler Master unit, the heat pipes are center weighted in the full size base. Now this is fine because they were designed for Threadripper 1000 and Threadripper 2000, which has a center weighting fundamentally to the thermal perspective of the chiplets. With that said, Threadripper 3000 is different, and especially the 3990X, because there is significant heat shedding components, i.e. chiplets, out to the edges of the Threadripper heat spreader. So if you've got center weighted heat components, which are doing the real bulk work of moving the heat away from the processor, that is going to be a problem. The Noctua, by comparison, is very balanced with its heat pipe orientation on the full-size base, and by extension the IceGiant ProSiphon Elite. And with the Noctua, the heat pipes actually make good contact out to the wider areas and the outer edges of the Threadripper 3990X. And this is critical because you've got 8 chiplets underneath there, and they are weighted to the outer edges. We think this is the case simply because we looked at some of our test data for the Be Quiet cooler and the Cooler Master cooler and compared it to the other coolers, and also compared it to the Corsair liquid cooler. And that comparison to the Corsair liquid cooler is very important because we know the Corsair is not full cover. And what we see is that 4 of the CCDs, so 4 of the core chiplets, are actually operating at a specific temperature, which is reasonable. And then you've got another group of 4 that are operating at a significantly higher temperature. Now one would assume, I think it's fair to justify that these specific higher temperature CCDs are the outer edge CCDs that are not getting as good thermal contact from the specific thermal removal heat pipes and the specific cooling device on the CPU cooler itself. And these are the edge chiplets that are rising quicker in temperature and therefore driving instability on the Be Quiet and the Cooler Master cooler because they're triggering thermal shutoff. So basically, the fact that you've got small chiplets on the outer edge of the Threadripper heat spreader, which are not physically connected to the other chiplets they work in tandem with, or the central I/O die, it means their heat is very localized to the outer edges of the heat spreader, and therefore the heat spreader is doing a tough job at trying to remove all that energy along its surface area. This was not the case with Threadripper 1000 and 2000 because you had up to 4 dies which could transmit their heat and conduct the heat down the silicon dies towards the center of the heat spreader where the cooling mass was basically focused. That's not the case here because the thermal density and the location and the lack of physical contact on those outer chiplets makes for a different situation. And that's nothing against Be Quiet or Cooler Master or any of the other manufacturers whose hardware we could have tested and found the same results. They were obviously designing for Threadripper 1000, by extension Threadripper 2000. Threadripper 3000 with its chiplet design is fundamentally dissimilar, even though the heat spreader is similarly sized. It's very different under the hood. The areas for the mean heat generation and the mean hotspots are very different to the 1000 and 2000 series Threadripper parts. And if you want that statement in written form, head on over to the Kikaroo website because it's quite difficult to comprehend, quite difficult to understand. It might take a few read-throughs, but we've done a lot of data to check, and this is what we think is basically going on. We're quite confident of it. Unfortunately, we can't simply chop up the bases of the Be Quiet and Cooler Master coolers at the moment. We had hoped to, but we don't have access to the machinery because of the ongoing global issues, so that's a bit of a shame at the moment. With our noise results rounded to the nearest whole number, as we struggle to consistently record and tell the difference between decimals, Be Quiet has the quietest cooler. This comes as a little surprise given the unit's excellent silent wings fans that run at relatively low speeds for a CPU cooler. Of course, the trade-off for this low noise operation is reduced cooling performance, but that may be a compromise that some users are happy with, and that's without delving into temperature normalized cooling results on the higher performance competitors. Noctua's single fan U14S comes in a close second with the noise output that I would be perfectly happy to sit next to all day long. The single 1500 RPM A15 fan is superb, and Noctua's heatsink design is well optimized to take advantage of its slow, low noise operation. The IceGiant and Noctua coolers are roughly tied for noise output when running dual fan mode, albeit with the former using reduced fan speeds. This is an interesting result as the CPU thermal performance, cooling capacity and associated VRM temperatures were also closely matched. As we've already pointed out, the IceGiant cooler is evidently optimized for high-speed, high-pressure fans by means of a dense fin array. The same point is not true for the Noctua heatsink. That perhaps means that the Pro Siphon Elite is being somewhat disproportionately hamstrung by the reduced fan speed. Conversely, the 2200 RPM operating mode can also be seen as blasting its way to the top of our cooling charts. It depends on your individual preference and perspective, of course. The noisiest unit is the IceGiant cooler with its pair of 2200 RPM fans run at full speed. As this unit is the 2019 prototype, the fan choice is not necessarily representative of the 2020 edition. With that said, IceGiant has made it perfectly clear that they're gunning for high performance operation, and the website highlights potentially using 2500 RPM fans, albeit of a quality and design that we do not yet know about. Not all that much quieter than the IceGiant is the Corsair H115i RGB Pro XT at full 2000 RPM fan speed. I wouldn't really want to sit next to either of the loudest coolers run at full fan speed for my entire workday. But with that said, I also would not care how loud they are when running an overnight batch of compute work with nobody else in the office. Again, noise output is subjective as to whether you care, how much you care, and how much cooling performance you're willing to compromise. I'm going to keep this quite brief to close out because it's already certainly been long enough. But put simply, if we summarize, the 64-core 8CCD single IO die Threadripper 3990X is very tough to cool. It isn't as simple as it seems by any stretch of the imagination. High-end air cooling with Threadripper specific blocks are good go-to options, but also a good high-end AIO, while not as good as the higher-end air coolers which are Threadripper specific, does a perfectly reasonable job if you do need an AIO specifically. As far as overclocking, you're going to get more frequency out of the air coolers because they're just better coolers in the case of the IceGiant and the Noctua. The IceGiant is a very high performance unit, clearly. It uses high speed fans, it's optimized for high thermal performance because of its thermal siphon technology. It performed very, very well in our chassis environment. The Noctua also impressed us a lot, to be perfectly honest. It's clearly more optimized for lower noise operation, a better balance, arguably, between noise and performance. But for day-to-day usage with tolerable noise levels, it's actually very well optimized, very well balanced, and it's pretty reasonably priced too. So both of those are pretty good options. I'm certainly excited to see the 2020 retail edition of the IceGiant Pro Siphon Elite with different fans and the thinner unit. That's quite exciting as far as I'm concerned. It really is something new on the cooling scene that is battling against high-end AIO, high-end air coolers on a really high-end, high-power platform. So that's really good to see. I am excited. I've been Luke Hill for Kit Guru. Thank you for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below and in the comment section on the Kit Guru website. A lot of work went into this. It was actually quite challenging, especially when looking at some of the air coolers that didn't perform as we expected, which we could only realistically find by actually testing the Threadripper 3990X specifically. So that really was quite interesting. Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Like I said, like, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff if you like the video. If you want to support us, head on over to our Patreon page, buy a cool t-shirt as well, and I'll see you in the next one.